want to sit there to start with, and then...
Yes, I'm just going to switch my mic on whilst... I'm tangled from everything else.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome here to St Mary's Barns. I'm Andrew Summers, the chairman of the Friends of St Mary's Barns, and it's a great pleasure to again be holding a book event for Richard Harris. This event was originally planned, I think, in April last year. It then got postponed until November. It then got postponed again until now. But we are here. We've still got social distancing, but we are here. And we're still wearing masks, but we're delighted that we're able to hold this event. We're calling it a book launch, because it is a launch, even though the book has been published a year ago, but even so, I think we can still regard it as a launch here in Barnes. Again, be able to welcome one of Richard's books. It's his 30th, well, I think it's his 30th, and he tells me there is another one coming. At least one, I'm sure, so they're in the pipeline. But Richard, you're prolific in so many ways, not only in books, but in lots of other things, in broadcasting and everything else. And we're delighted to have you here in Barnes. And it's a special pleasure to welcome Ben Quash, Professor Ben Quash, Professor of Christianity and the Arts at King's College London. Definitely one of the best-known people to discuss the whole issue of Christianity and the arts and to comment on the sort of perspectives that Richard is bringing to these wonderful images that he has in the book and which you'll see on the screen. The book is available here thanks to Barnes Bookshop. Thank you very much to Venetia for coming and selling the book. So please, if you haven't got it already, buy one. And thank you very much there are some drinks available which needs to be served at your chair, of course, because we're not allowed to hold them at a bar. But if you want one, then please feel free to go and get one. Or no, to ask for one to be delivered. Richard will be taking some questions at the end, and because we're not able to use microphones amongst the audience, then we ask you to speak up when you do that. It's a wonderful book. It's been fascinating to read it and to see Richard's perspectives, and I'll be fascinated also to hear Ben's perspectives on Richard's comments and on the images. So please welcome Richard Harris and Ben Quash.
Thank you very much, Andrew, without whom, as always, none of these events would take place. You're organizing them all so beautifully. And it's wonderful to have Ben here. As you've already heard, there's nobody better qualified to talk about this subject. And I'm very much looking forward myself to hearing his reflections. First of all, can everybody hear me all right? Is the sound working? It's not working. Does it need to be? The main thing is to get it. Because you know that wonderful story when a bishop went to a microphone at a big event like this, tapped it a few times, and suddenly over the tannoy system came the words, "I think this isn't working." And of course, it's a good, well-trained Anglican congregation there who all immediately was like, "And also with you." Anyway, I think it is now working. I asked Ben to select the images in my book that he would like to respond to, and in addition to that, I asked him to select a few images that are not in the book, which he'd like to talk about, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing him talking about those images as well as the ones in my book. Shall I, Ben, just say something about why I wrote the book before, and then we move on to our conversation? I think I wrote the book because we live in a visual age, and there is so much visual culture. And I love art, and so it just seemed a very obvious thing to do to try to convey the great beauty of the Christian faith and through its greatest works of art. I had to limit myself to one work of art per artist, otherwise I could have filled the book with certain artists alone. I wanted to make it ancient and modern, Eastern and Western, so there's a great variety of work here. Some very well-known works of art, others will be totally unknown to you. The book follows a rough kind of pattern indicating sort of before time, in Christ. It also takes you in a very subtle kind of way through the sort of main themes of the Bible, the law, the prophets, wisdom, suffering, the historic ministry of Jesus, and then in Christ. So that's just a very loose kind of formula. So, Ben, is there anything you want to say before we look at that first image? Anything else we need to know before we go, or should we have the first image?
Well, only that, I sound audible. Am I audible? Good. To say that it is indeed a lovely book, and one of the nicest things about finding it in my hands and knowing that Richard and I would be speaking is that when Richard said which particular images would you like to focus on that you like best, nearly all of them were ones that I would have wanted to. And so in a way that we're only just scraping the surface of this book. But the other thing I want to say about it before we start is that the prayers at the end of each section are as beautifully chosen as the works of art that begin each section. And one of the things that struck me as I've been reading it and rereading it is the way that each section, each of the 30 sections in the book, launches you with the artwork, and then in the sort of discursive prose that leads up to the prayer at the end, it sort of builds you up to pray the prayer. But when you do it, it sort of circles all the way back to the image again. So sort of each one of the 30 is almost like a sort of circle. And the prayer enhances your appreciation of the work of art as you revisit it. And you can sort of, a bit like the Gospel of Mark, you can go back to the beginning and read the whole thing again, and gain even more the second time round. So if you are reading it, please make sure you read it more than once, I would say, because it really rewards that.
Well, that's very kind of you. I should say that in the prose in the book, I'm not talking about that tonight. That goes off into some kind of theological understanding of the picture, which I don't go into. We're not talking about tonight. Tonight we're really focusing on the images. But I think without any more ado, Rachel, could we kindly have that first image? The mosaic. Yeah, there we are. Have a good look at that. The 12th century in Sicily was a most wonderfully rich culture, a mixture of Arab culture, Byzantine culture, and the Normans, because the Normans under Roger II had a great kingdom in Sicily in the 12th century. And there are some wonderful 12th century mosaics in Sicily, particularly in Palermo, and one set in Monreale Cathedral. Now, this is particularly interesting because clearly the workmanship of this is clearly from the Byzantine artists working in Constantinople. They were the only people really who had the skill to do this. But probably the iconography is really kind of mainly Western. Now, one of the things I think which is emerging, I hope will emerge, there's a slight difference of approach in understanding of art between Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity. Eastern Christianity sees art as a way into meditation and prayer, whereas the Western Church has seen it really as an educative tool. Now, this is clearly an educative tool, trying to explain that God creates the world, but I also find something meditative about it. I think what I love particularly here is the way Jesus, who here is the second person of the Trinity, by whom and through him, whom all things were created, according to the Christian creed. He's holding up his hand there. And that, for me, is a hand which, as it were, lets creation go. To be created is to have a life of one's own. But also it's a hand of blessing. God created the world and he saw that it was all very, very good. So that's a hand of letting things go and also blessing it because it's good. And one other thing about it, which I think is very interesting, he's holding a scroll in his hand. I don't know whether Ben will have views about what's in that scroll, but I like to think of it as not just the moral law, but actually what we would call the scientific regularities, the laws of nature, on the basis of which, of course, the whole universe operates. Anyway, that's one of those 12th century mosaics I love. What does that bring to mind for you then, Ben?
I think the fact that it's this figure, as Bishop Richard says, is readable as the second person of the Trinity, means that it's, in the terms of the beginning of John's Gospel, it's the Logos, and that's a word which we're very familiar with that gets translated as the Word. But Logos can mean quite a lot of things. There's a sort of a range of possible meanings for that, and I think this may relate to the scroll. It can mean reason or rationality or wisdom. And so in the beginning was the Word. You can hear that, and you should hear that also as in the beginning was wisdom, and in the beginning was rationality. And so maybe that scroll simply represents, Logos itself. And that is the sort of rules, the grain of the universe, the very grain of the universe, the rules by which it operates. But also wisdom has that sense of a warmth and a life-giving property to this word, which I think is also very appropriate. So the mere touch of a hand, the mere extension of a hand, the whole of creation comes into being. And although creation is time-bound and distended through time, it's also a whole. Even in its temporality, even in its stretched outness, creation is a whole. And it's impossible to show all of its infinite variety and indeed its temporality. But somehow these very strong, simple circles capture the sense that in all of its diversity, in all of its wonder and variety, all the pied beauty, to quote Gerard Manley Hopkins, it is nevertheless something that hangs together fundamentally and is a whole. So it captures the simplicity and the wholeness, if you like, of a creation that is at the same time infinitely diverse, all of it held in the divine wisdom.
And it's the circles for you particularly which brings that wholeness to light.
Actually, it reminds me, there's a fresco by the Italian Renaissance artist Giovanni di Paolo, which combines very much this sort of iconography, the divine figure outside the circles of the creation, with immediately to the right of it, the expulsion of Adam and Eve. And what you get there is, if you like, this very stark juxtaposition of the completeness of the good creation at the beginning of time, and then the beginning of the sort of pacing out of fallen time, which follows on the expulsion of Adam and Eve, which may be setting us up.
Well, I think that's set up the cue for the next image very beautifully, because here we move on to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden.
You'll recognize from the cover.
I think that is sheerly beautiful in its harmony, its peacefulness, and it's just wonderful beauty. I always think that fruit in the trees, those apples, they're looking so delicious. You feel you want to reach up and pluck one and have a great bite of it. You can see why Eve wants to do it. And the Eve's body and Adam's body is so beautiful, and the wonderful way in which all the animals there are living at peace with one another. It is truly an Eden. And although there's a snake there, and it's called temptation, actually, to me, it's not so much the temptation that comes across, but actually the sheer beauty and harmony of paradise as we have imagined it as human beings, as life as it ought to be. What about you, Ben? What do you like about that?
Yes, the animals, unlike in some images of the fall, because this is the moment of the fall, the animals are still relatively peaceful, although, can you see the lion on the right-hand side, just sort of a little bit back from the foreground, starting to eye up the deer, the two deer in the foreground. So you can see there's where the beginnings of the fall beginning to creep into the animal kingdom. He's got his eye on that meal. And so I like that sense of this being a sort of tipping point. And as Richard says, there's a poise and a beauty to this, but at the same time, a sense of a certain ominousness. Look at the sky at the top, the way that it's beginning to lower. There's a lighter bit of sky lower down, just above the vegetation, but above it is this more oppressive, darker sky. So you've got a sense of something descending, as well as this glint in the lion's eye, all of which I think captures beautifully that sense of everything about to change and nothing will be the same again as a result of this. I also, on a more humorous note, find hilarious the way that I think probably humorously and slightly mischievously, Cranach has sort of painted one of the antlers of the deer at front left, so that it sort of forms a kind of codpiece under Adam's genitals. You see that the top fork of the antlers is very neatly framing these genitals, which of course are elaborately concealed behind leaves, but nevertheless our attention is rather drawn to them in a way that sort of both gives and takes at the same time. So there's humor in this too, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think let's move on to the next image, which brings out something rather more somber.
Absolutely, yes.
As you can see, have a good look at that. That is a very, very famous picture and a kind of decisive picture for art historians, because they see in that the beginning of what we think of as perspective in the early period of the Renaissance. That's very often picked out as one of the main kind of turning points in the development of Western art. And perhaps Ben will want to say something more about that, but I do think also it packs a very strong emotional punch. I mean, the kind of sheer anguish with which Adam and Eve are leaving the garden, and the fierceness with which the angel, the flaming angel, is sending them out and refusing to allow them to go back. So there's a very strong emotion conveyed through that. I'm not a great fan of Milton, but I do love the words that Milton wrote about this scene, about Adam and Eve being expelled from Eden. He wrote, "Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They, hand in hand, with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way." It's a very moving verse indicating that although they've been expelled from Eden, they have all the world before them. And they go through Eden hand in hand, and although they wept that they've been swept out of Eden, nevertheless they realize they've got the world before them in which to live, places to live and take their rest, and the providence to guide them. And so there's a kind of wonderful twist on that story, I think, in Milton. But Ben, what about?
Oops. Yes, this is one of my top three, actually, I have to say.
Right.
If you're very eagle-eyed and you compare what you can see on the screen with what's in the book, you'll see that this is an earlier version before the picture restorers removed the leaves that are covering their genitals. So the version in the book shows them exposed, which is how I think they would originally have been painted. I think that this is extraordinary for various reasons. One is that unlike many scenes of the expulsion from Eden, we don't see Eden at all. So lots of paintings of the expulsion will show you Eden in the background. Here we can't even see it. We just see that portal, which is almost at right angles to us, and a divine ray, which would originally have been silver, but it's discolored over time, so now is black, which actually sort of almost inadvertently adds to the force of the violence, in a sense, of their expulsion, the fact that this is a dark moment for them. I also find it very moving how their bodies are both synchronized and yet at odds with each other. So they're sort of walking in step, but they also, their gestures almost sort of contrast with each other. So Adam's head tilts downwards and Eve's tilts backwards and upwards. He raises his right hand to his face. She raises her left to her breast. And although they're walking in step, they're out of step in the sense that his left leg strides forward and her right leg. So it captures this sense of a simultaneous new predicament that they are cast into, which they share, and this quality of at-oddsness, which is the mark of their new reality. The one other thing I'd want to say about this, which strikes the note of hope, which I think Richard's also brought out with that quotation from Milton, is that if you see this in its context, part of a larger series of frescoes, you realize the direction in which they're walking is the direction of the altar. So there is, as it were, a place awaiting them beyond this tragedy, beyond this trial, which will be their redemption, even though we can't see Eden, they can't see Eden, they can't see yet where eventually they will be transformed once again and restored once again. But it's there, and we can see it when we see it in that.
Yes, so where would the altar be, Ben, in relation to
So
that?
they're very high up on the left in the scheme. So the altar is, as it were, it's below them, but it's in this direction, the direction in which they're walking, but further down in the chapel. So there's that sense of they're being drawn towards the east, the liturgical east, where the redemption awaits them and is enacted in the sacrament.
I think that's a good cue to move on to something very, very different. This is an icon, a modern icon by Patricia Fosteropoulos, called the Icon of Loving Kindness. There are two main types of icon with the Virgin Mary and the Christ child as a babe. One is simply called Hodegetria, which means pointing the way, where Mary holds out her hand pointing to Christ. Because the point about these icons is not so much that they meant to focus your mind on Mary, the Theotokos, the God-bearer, but you're meant to focus your mind upon the Word made flesh for us, because so she points to him. So this is partly like the Hodegetria, it's pointing to Jesus the babe, but what makes it different is that there's clearly great tenderness. She's pulling the babe up to her cheek and holding the babe close. What I'm saying now links to another icon which we're showing later on, but when I left as Dean of Kings, people kindly raised a sum of money as a farewell present, and partly out of that, I ordered an icon, and what I ordered was an icon which we'll be seeing later. And I had this icon, the other icon, in my chapel at Oxford, and my good friend Alex Fosteropoulos, who's a priest in the Orthodox Church, came, and I proudly showed him this icon, and he didn't seem to be quite as impressed as I was. So I said, well, I thought she was the best icon painter in the country. And he sort of didn't quite want to answer that. So I said, well, if she isn't, who is? And he said rather shyly, well, my wife, actually. So this is Father Alexander Fosteropoulos' wife, who's painted that. And she paints the most beautiful icons. She's painted the icons in the Russian Orthodox Cathedral in London. And just a point about it, icons are painted not simply as works of art, but as works of prayer. Strictly speaking, we shouldn't talk about painting icons, but reading icons. And it's regarded as a spiritual art and a spiritual discipline. The icon painters do it in prayer and through prayer. They see it actually as an act of prayer through and through. And of course, as I indicated earlier on, icons are not meant to be simply works of art, but they are kind of transparent to the divine, which is present with us all times, in and through all things. But I love that icon, and I have it in my study at home.
As Richard said, the two sort of classic Madonna and child icons are the Hodegetria, the pointing Madonna, and this one. And it's interesting to look at how both of those have had a sort of legacy in Western art where they've almost ramified into sort of other paraphrases of the ideas that are contained in these two seminal types. So what we see in the West as an extension of the Hodegetria, the Virgin who shows the way, are images like the Madonna who kneels apart from the Christ child, but kneels before him. So he's often laid on the ground. Some of you will know the Piero della Francesca image of this in the National Gallery, so that she's showing the way even more dramatically through a distance from herself, between herself and the Christ child. But it's the same principle of directing us towards him. And the extension of this one, I think we see in many Western images of the Virgin breastfeeding. So that sense of distance that arises out of the one, but intense intimacy that arises out of this tradition. And I think that touching of cheek to cheek is supremely intimate and very powerful. And it leads, as I say, to many other images that explore almost in a more explicitly emotional way the bond between mother and child and what it meant for Jesus genuinely to be the child of a human mother and for her to be the mother of this child. And so, yes, so this is a wonderful sort of distillation and container of all that might be read out of it into that exploration of Christ's infant humanity.
Well, I'd love to go on to talk a little bit about the difference between the two, the West and East now, but we'd better move on because people want to see the images, sadly, but we may come back to it later. This I regard as an absolutely fabulous image. Stanley Spencer grows and grows in stature. He's many people's favorite artist. His paintings are quite unmistakable, outside the fashion of the time, but distinctively himself. He painted this series called Christ in the Wilderness, which is in the Gallery of Western Australian Art in Perth. The whole series is there, and this is one of that series, Christ with the Scorpion. And the scorpion in his hand looks about to sting, and all around on the floor you can see there are other scorpions there. But what comes across quite simply here, overwhelmingly, is the sense of sheer pity that the figure has in his eyes and face looking down at that scorpion. The scorpion which, so it is said, can kill us, but he's still looking down with that total sense of pity. I find this a very, very moving painting. I think that's all I'll say about it, because Ben, you might want to say some rather more.
No, well, actually, I think what you write about this is just exquisite, and there's very little I can add to it. But that sense of the scorpion almost being us, that the creature that's built this carapace around it, become dangerous in order to survive, is us. And that pity that you describe, and that infinite patience, which seems to be embodied in the attentive gaze of Christ, is what redeems us, who are scorpion-like in so many ways. So I think for that reason it's an extremely powerful evocation of the patience involved in our redemption somehow. But also, as you point out, Richard, in what you write, that there's a phrase in the Gospels about who, if their child asks for bread, would give them a scorpion. And in a sense, this is, as it were, the substitute for bread, the good gift. And Christ nevertheless receives even the bad gifts that the world offers in order, eventually, as we know, to offer back to that world the good gifts of bread. So it's us, but it's also a token of the bread, which will be Christ's gift of himself in return.
Credit where credit's due. I got that idea from Stephen Cottrell, who's now the Archbishop of York, because he's a great fan of Stanley Spencer as well. Let's have the next one, if we could, Rachel. Well, here is the other icon, which I have got in my study. The Transfiguration of Jesus, one of the key incidents in the Gospel, of course, where they go up to a mountain, James and John and Peter, and they see Jesus transfigured before them, as whiter than any white fuller could make them, as the gospel says. And Jesus there appears radiant in these circles, what are technical a mandorla. And on the left, as you look, our left, there's Elijah, and on the right, there's Moses. Elijah representing the prophets and Moses representing the law, and Jesus being seen there as the fulfillment of both the law and the prophets. And of course, the disciples sleeping. In a lot of these icons, you see mountains, rather bare mountains with trees growing out, green trees. It almost seems to be an indication that sort of out of things that are barren, new life, green life can come. But it's a very powerful scene, I think, both when you read it in the Gospels and especially when you see it in painting. There are, of course, as you know, Ben, some very famous Western depictions of this. But anyway, what would you like to say about this?
Well, I think and to choose an icon of the Transfiguration is to choose the icon of all icons, in a way, because the event of the Transfiguration is an event in which matter, a human body, becomes irradiated with uncreated light. So the divine radiates itself, communicates itself through material flesh. And that's what icons do. They take material things, wood and paint, and of course icons can be more than painted boards. They can be mosaics and you know, by extension, all kinds of other works of physical, visual art. But the idea is that matter itself becomes the mediator of divine light. And all icons do that, but the icon of the Transfiguration is, if you like, the key to unlock the meaning of all icons, because it's in that icon we see matter displaying the glory of God and communicating it to us in that way.
Perhaps there's just one more thing to say about icons, and that is the icon painters don't hesitate to follow the prototypes and the models of the past. And this is actually basically following the model of a great 13th, 14th century Russian icon painter, a really sublime one, which is in the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow. Perhaps we better move on, Rachel, sadly. Now, you've chosen this, Ben.
Yes.
Tell us why you've chosen it, why you like it.
So, yes, I did choose this. This is one of a series of paintings by Giovanni Bellini, which explore, and there's one in the National Gallery that you may know called The Blood of the Redeemer, which is a full-length Christ. But what these are images of Jesus at an indeterminate point, possibly not even a historical point, in the sequence. You know, you can't locate it in the sequence of the Passion narrative. Why? Well, because he's bearing the wounds, so this is of his crucifixion, so this is post the crucifixion, and yet he's alert, awake, so he's not dead, but he's not yet risen. This is not the body of the risen Christ that Bellini is showing us. That's even more evident in The Blood of the Redeemer, but I think it's true also of this one. So this is a Christ in whom, as it were, both what's to come and what's already happened are folded into an image that isn't a narrative image. It's a sort of container for the meaning of both the crucifixion and the resurrection and what will follow it. And if we ask what that meaning is, I think part of the key in this painting, and I could go on for hours about this one, I have to say, but part of the key is this rend in his tunic, which you can see opens onto a further rend in his side. It's the wound in his side. But as the art historian Paul Hills, who is an emeritus professor at the Courtauld Institute, has pointed out, Bellini in this particular version, unlike the other ones he's done, has placed the wound very high up beneath the nipple of Christ, so that it almost creates the effect of not so much a wound as a fold beneath his breast. And I think, as Paul does, that this is a deliberate move by Bellini to suggest that Christ invites us to be admitted, as it were, to be folded into his body, as into a body that will give us nurture. And there's a long tradition in much mystical writing, medieval especially, that reflects on the maternal characteristics of Christ's body, that, as it were, we come and receive sustenance from Christ. And the Eucharist, which often is associated with the wound in his side, the blood of the Redeemer shows an angel catching the blood from his side in a chalice. Here, it isn't transferred to us in a chalice so much as offered to us through an invitation to draw near and be, as it were, be folded into an intimacy with his body. Now, that's quite strong beer. Some people may recoil from that, but I find it very powerful.
That's very helpful, because I was very, very puzzled by that rent. The rent in the garment itself is so big, and then, as you say, we tend to see the breast rather than the wound. But did it also help to give rise to the cult of the heart of Jesus? Because the cult of the heart of Jesus lets you into the life of Jesus, so it's related to that as well.
I think it often is, although it's on the wrong side in this case.
Oh yes.
Which is a shame, but
the heart of Jesus would be on the left.
Sacred heart, yes, the heart's on the left, isn't it? So
right.
It doesn't quite work. But the other thing that Paul Hills draws out is that one of the Latin words for fold is sinus, S-I-N-U-S. And it's more typically used of the folds of a toga. And we can see how much time and care Bellini has taken here over the folds of the tunic. He's very interested in folds. And here he's rendered them in these sort of fluted, almost like fluted columns. They're beautiful. But a man that interested as a painter in rendering the sinus, the fold, and who had decent Latin, let's assume he did, would also have known that the same word is sometimes used of a breast, a fold, that's as it were a fold in the body. So here we see, I think, a sort of playing with the idea of folds, moving from clothing to body.
I can see why you like that, Ben. Yeah, we would love to hear you for an hour or two, but we better look at the next one as time is moving on. I'll just say something briefly about this. I think I first got into art when, as an undergraduate, I traveled on the continent with friends in one of my friend's mother's old A40 car. We slept out rough, and we spent our time looking at galleries and museums for a month, a wonderful thing that university students seem to be able to do in those days. And I remember going into Milan in the refectory at the Santa Maria delle Grazie and being literally totally overwhelmed by this painting. It totally overpowered me. Because it's been, for years, people couldn't see it because it was under restoration. Now it has been restored. I'm not quite sure whether this is the restored version or not. But the key moment there, of course, is where Christ knows that somebody's going to betray him, and everybody says, who is it? Is it me? Who is it? Who is it? And it's that sort of moment of consternation that has been caught. Over to you, Ben.
It's almost impossible to say anything new about this, isn't it? But you have to include it because it's the beginning of a meme, which so many artists, a bit like Michelangelo's creation of Adam and the Sistine Chapel ceiling. It's probably next to that the most imitated work of Christian art, and it's been used by so many other later artists to sort of invest, to produce new meanings out of it. So, for example, there's a famous, there's a painting by an Israeli photographic artist called Adi Ness, who has this scene based very closely around Leonardo's composition with a group of Israeli soldiers photographed in all of the positions of the disciples. And they're real young Israeli soldiers. And so, he, as it were, takes this setting and hangs on it a new set of people, exploring a new set of fraternal bonds and relationships and what it is to live, as it were, in proximity to potential death. And there have been lots of feminist explorations of this in which there is, it's been entirely women. There's one called Yo Mama's Last Supper, which is fantastic and very definitely provocative version of this with a naked black female central figure in the place of Christ. So I just find it interesting to reflect on how works like this can be read as part of the story of faith, and this undoubtedly played a crucial part in the life of the monks who ate their meals under it. This is not for a church, as Richard said. It was for a place in which communal life was lived in the most ordinary way through eating, but took those mundane experiences of eating together and set them against the backdrop of divine provision and the divine calling to make even ordinary things sacred. So it's part of the story of faith, but it's also, probably more than nearly anything else, part of the story of art. And as part of the story of art, it develops its own life and is as enduringly appealing to people of no religion or of other religions as it is to Christians who've done a million different things with this image.
Sounds as though there's a book there, Ben.
For someone else to write.
Yeah, I think you, right, Rachel, thank you so much. You say something about this?
Well, as we were talking about folds, I find this this woodcut from Albrecht Dürer's Small Passion. It's the frontispiece for his Small Passion. Well, it's profoundly moving because it's actually in the same genre of image as the Bellini. This is also a version of the Man of Sorrows, or what's often called the Imago Pietatis in Latin. So an image of Christ in dereliction, what's at this indistinct point in the story of the Passion. But unlike the Bellini, there's no trace yet here of the resurrection. But he's, again, wounded and yet alive. And it makes me think of a famous statement by Jim Elkins, who's an American-based art historian, who talks about the way that works of visual art look at us. We don't just look at them, they look at us. We're under the gaze of these works of art. And that's true very evidently of the icon tradition. But actually, I think it's true of great works of Western art as well, and this is a great of that. And yet, paradoxically, Christ does not look at us with his eyes, because he's buried his face in one of his hands, to the point that it's almost as if he wants to disappear into the wound in his palm. There's this sense of a crumpling in on himself, where he would almost seeks to vanish into himself in this dereliction. And yet, look at the wounds in his feet. They look at us. And I think what Dürer has done is, as it were, create a different way in which this work of art engages us, searches us, requires a response from us, looks at us through these displaced eyes, which are, as it were, the wounds in his feet. So it's just, for me, a very, very powerful and expressive image in that way.
It'd be lovely to talk a little bit more about, but we're rapidly running out of time, so we better move on to the next one, please, Rachel. And this, I know, is one that you...
Sorry, another of mine. Rich,
yeah.
We should hear more about yours.
Well, no, we will move on fairly quickly after this, but you need to see the whole of that, and then let's see the next one, because it's the details, particularly, that Ben wants to say something about.
So that's Mary Magdalene on the right-hand side. And what I love about this, apart from the fact that it's been said, and I think it's true, that this is an epochal moment in the depiction of realistic tears in Western art. The tears that she's weeping are completely exquisite, and no one had ever painted tears like that before. And they've been positioned, this has been composed so that her tears are falling in a direct line down from her eyes, through her hands, towards the wounds.
The tears are difficult to see.
They're in this image, I'm afraid they are, but please go and look at a high-quality image of this afterwards. They're falling directly down towards where the wounds in his feet are positioned. That's the first thing I really want to sort of get you to think about. And the second is that, of course, Mary Magdalene in tradition is associated with anointing Jesus' feet with her tears when he's alive. What's happened here, and therefore abasing herself at his feet. So she's very typically depicted on her knees at his feet. What's happened here with the deposition is that his body has been, as it's removed from the cross, has been tilted horizontally. And it's almost as if Mary Magdalene, remaining focused on his feet, as she did in life, in his life, in remaining focused on his feet, is herself raised up by following them to a position of greater dignity. So his, as it were, his decline, or his being rendered prostrate, achieves her raising up. But all she needs to do is remain devoted to the feet. And I think that's just a brilliant piece of...
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Let's have the next image. I've chosen this by Norman Adams. My wife and I, many years ago, went to an exhibition at the Royal Academy of a Passion series, or the Stations of the Cross by Norman Adams, and we were totally overwhelmed with them, which that's first alerted me to him. He was the keeper of the Royal Academy. That series is now in what's called Little St. Mary's in Manchester, a little Roman Catholic church. But this one I particularly love because it's so difficult to get the balance right between depicting the crucifixion and the resurrection. How do you hold together both? Crucifixion, which is simply torture, the resurrection, which is not simply a happy ending tucked on at the end. It can't be seen like that. Somehow they have to be seen together. And this is one of the few paintings I know which holds them together, because the crucifixion is there, and you can see on the right as you look at the soldiers, you can see the women with the outstretched hands mourning. There's the black in there, the somber black, the darkness, but it is also seen in the light of the golden wings of the butterflies. So it's the crucifixion seen through the eyes of the resurrection. And for me, that's a wonderful, really wonderful achievement. I think we'd better move on so that people can just see one or two others. Just something briefly about this. When Constantine became the Roman emperor in the beginning of the 4th century, he brought his mother over from Britain, Helena her name, and according to the tradition, she discovered the places on where Christ was crucified and where he rose from the dead. And of course, a church was built there, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which you'll see in Jerusalem today. And pilgrims came, but what they saw there was not actually, of course, the grave. What they had built there was a rotunda like that, with a slab of marble there indicating that Christ had raised from the dead. So this is what pilgrims to Jerusalem would have seen in the 6th century. And the wonderful other mosaics in Ravenna, 6th century Ravenna, some of the great masterpieces of the world in the churches in Ravenna from the 6th century, these mosaics. But anyway, as I say, that's what they would have seen in the 6th century. We better just move on really quickly just to see one or two more. Ben, you say something briefly about this.
I think probably you know more than I do, Richard, about this, but it's Kerry Richards' painting of the Supper at Emmaus takes its place in a long tradition of studies of this, perhaps most famously Caravaggio's. He did 2 versions, actually, but the most famous one is also in the National Gallery in London. And I think Kerry Richards has picked up a certain element of Caravaggio here in the disciple whose back is to us, that sense of the shoving of the chair, which you see in Caravaggio's painting, in one of the disciples, literally in the act of shoving his chair back in a way that sort of creates a real tangible sense of drama, and also a rather unsettling sense that it might tumble out of the picture space into your own. And I think to have picked up on that in Caravaggio's painting and others, but to have reproduced it here in a much more sort of contemporary study of this episode is to pick up something that's very important in Luke's gospel itself, where this is described. And that's the breaking of the boundary between a historical event and a present event. Because what happens at Emmaus, what happens when Luke tells the story of Emmaus, is he says, the moment that those disciples recognize who Jesus is in the breaking of the bread, is the same moment you experience every time you gather to celebrate the Eucharist. So it's not just then, it's now. And that's happening in Luke's gospel textually. But paintings like Caravaggio's and this one are picking up on that and doing it all over again by saying it's still happening, that breaking of the fourth wall of the theatre, that moment where suddenly what seemed to be a thing of the past, is all over again present.
Wonderful the way he depicted Christ as both there and not there against the background of that yellow. The remarkable thing about this is that it was commissioned by the Junior Common Room of St. Edmund Hall, Oxford. Imagine a Junior Common Room in Oxford or Cambridge commissioning such works of art now. Because Phil knows, because he was there at the time. Oh, later was it? Oh, right. Okay, we better have a glance at the next one. Say something fairly quickly about this.
Well, we've been talking about Caravaggio, but there you go. I mean, this is one of my other top three. He did two of these as well. He liked doing things twice. The first one was rejected. I can't remember if it was by him or by the church for whom he made it. But what he did in this second version was strip out lots of the other characters and capture the sense that you get in this event, because it's narrated about 3 or 4 times in the Bible, differently, slightly differently, is capture the sense that only Paul is aware of what's happening. So the horse doesn't seem to be, neither does the ostler, only Paul. And then he throws him on the ground with this incredible foreshortening so that his whole body recedes backwards into the painting. And rather than like artists of previous eras showing us signs of God, or even God's very self descending, or Christ descending from out of the heavens, he gives us just this light which rakes down into this V shape that's created by Paul's open arms, and what you have is an empty space completely charged with the power and presence of God without him showing you anything in the space. That's Caravaggio's sheer brilliance. He knows how to use empty space to suggest absolute fullness of divine presence. And it's just brilliant, I think, for that reason.
And I don't think I want to add to that wonderful affirmation. So let's have the next slide. I'd like to say this is one that Ben chose. I've seen it myself in that great Anglican cathedral in Liverpool. Absolutely vast, vast cathedral, and it gives you a big shock. You go in and you immediately see this. But I have to say I view Tracy Emin very skeptically indeed. I got sick and tired of seeing her picture in the Evening Standard with a glass of wine in her hand at the latest fashionable party. But that is strangely moving in this vast cathedral, just to see those simple words, I felt you and I know you loved me. But why did you choose it, Ben?
I love it. And I think what it is a sort of modern riff on a triptych. So a 3-part altarpiece. It's not an altarpiece, of course. It's the other end of the church. But triptychs are made up of 3 parts. And what she's done is create 3 subsections to this sentence. It's her own handwriting, illuminated by pink neon. I felt you, and I knew you loved me. Those are the 3 sections. And you might read it left to right, like a normal sentence, and that would be fine. And I would begin it, so it would all be about the I who begins this sentence, and then arrives at the knowledge that you, whoever the you is, could be a human being, it could be God, she leaves it open, that this you loves her. But if you read it as a triptych, it completely changes everything, because what you have are 2 statements on the outer panels. I felt you, and you loved me, and they come together and meet in the middle, and I knew. And that's readable, therefore, as a sort of affirmation in her own hesitant way, an affirmation of some kind of, maybe not faith, but apprehension of what this love means for her, and the you loved me is as important, as it were, as a source of this, as the I felt you. So suddenly she's no longer the agent, she's the recipient of this knowledge that's vouchsafed to her, and I think that's beautiful. I also love the fact that this is viewable from the high altar of the cathedral. So feeling is a very interesting verb. You know, it's something you can do to something else. You can go and feel something or someone. But you can feel something when it happens to you. So, you know, if Richard came and patted me on the back now, I'd feel it. But it wouldn't have been anything I did. So the ambiguity about who is the cause of the feeling is there. But there's somebody at the altar who's touching the bread and wine, consecrating it. And in a sense, this speaks to them all the way down the whole length of the cathedral. and gives a new meaning also to the tactile nature of the Eucharist.
And I think we now come to our last ones, don't we? This is a, we'll move on to this in a second, but this is a window by Tom Denny in Hereford Cathedral to Thomas Traherne, the 17th century poet and mystic. So you can see the whole thing there. The reason why I chose it, because I was so struck by the bottom of that. If you could have the next image, please, which is that pool of water in it. That made a huge impression. Unfortunately, in the book, it's come across very, very badly. The image is much too small. You can't really see it. But I found something. I know some of the people I most respect hugely admire Tom Denny's windows, and perhaps best if you say something about him, because you just briefly, we've got about a minute or two, just to say why you particularly like that.
Well, matching Denny with Traherne is genius, because both of them have this sense of the presence of God in the English landscape, the English and Welsh landscape, where Ridian is here, and that's very important. So Traherne, in Herefordshire, had this particular exposure to what I think of as the sort of mystical empiricism of English spirituality, where real things, closely observed, speak of God's presence. And Denny's absolutely got that in his studies of the landscape. And it brings out, for a 21st century audience, the beauties of that 17th century sensibility that Traherne had.
Well, sadly, we've only got time for perhaps 2 or 3 questions, so I think let's get straight on with those questions, shall we, so that at least we've seen the images. Who would like to begin with the questions? And if you could ask a question standing up, please, so that other people can hear you. Anybody like to begin? Yes, Anne.
I was interested in what you were saying about the Sartre, particularly about what Ben was saying. I always thought that Eden was a rather strange place, because it's a place of perfect beauty, which is rather miserable God, it's ferocious and unforgiving and very stern. And then you have a world of pain and misery and a God that suddenly softens up rather. And I thought it was interesting when you were talking about the Sartre facing the altar, and you were saying that, there is an alternative other than Eden. But I wonder whether it's not also an attempt to reconcile, well, perhaps that's too extreme, ease a tension between 2 beings that are perhaps not altogether comfortable together.
Between
Over to
Adam
you.
and Eve, do you think?
2 different gods, the fierce God and the gentle God. Over to you.
Oh, dear.
Over to you.
Well, I wouldn't accept the distinction, I suppose, but it's an easy distinction to be led to make.
I think we need a long discussion about that,
That's a big
Anne.
one, yeah.
We'll sign you up. No, it's a very important, major question. I mean, I'm being serious, but it's a very difficult to kind of answer very
One
quickly.
little thing I would say is that Christians more than Jews have read the fall, as a more dramatic and absolute condemnation of Adam and Eve. So it's interesting that Christianity, which often gets associated with more loving God, has actually had the harsher reading of the fall than Jews, who only read the Hebrew Bible. So they don't read it in quite such a sort of...
And of course, in Eastern Christianity, it hasn't got the same impact that it has in the West. In the West, the expulsion from Eden is regarded as a kind of aboriginal calamity, to quote the words of Newman. But on the East, it's much more, as it were, a kind of blip on the way to being made more godlike. It's just sort of, an unfortunate fall, and it's serious, but you're still basically on the way to what God has in mind for us to be. Another question, please, anybody?